The airport buzzed with the usual chaos of travel, families dragging wheeled suitcases behind them. Business travelers fixated on their phones. Flight announcements echoing overhead. Children giggled as they darted past weary parents. And security lines stretched longer than they should. Amidst the sea of hurried passengers, Colonel Richard Hayes walked with a deliberate pace. His polished dress shoes clicking against the smooth tile floor. His crisp uniform, adorned with medals and insignia, stood in stark contrast to the casual attire of those around him. It wasn't just his presence that made people glance twice. It was the air of solemnity that clung to him like a shadow. Today was different. Hayes had traveled through countless airports in his years of service. But this time, he wasn't heading to a base, a mission briefing, or even home. Today, he carried a weight that went beyond the brass on his chest or the discipline ingrained in his every movement. He was escorting the remains of Private First Class Michael Dawson, a young soldier who had given his life in service of his country. Dawson was only 21, too young to be gone, too young to return home like this. The casket, draped in the American flag, was already waiting on the tarmac. Hayes had stood beside it as it was carefully unloaded, ensuring every movement was carried out with the respect and dignity it deserved. Now, his duty was to see it through to its final destination, where a grieving family would be waiting to say their last goodbyes. Steeling himself, Hayes approached the airline counter, his military orders and identification in hand. The process was supposed to be simple, routine. He had done this before. The airline personnel would verify his paperwork, acknowledge the significance of his assignment, and clear him to board without delay. It was, after all, an unspoken understanding. No unnecessary obstacles when a soldier was being brought home. He placed the documents on the counter with quiet precision, offering a firm but polite nod to the agent behind the desk. The woman, young and efficient-looking, barely glanced up at first, her fingers moving swiftly over the keyboard as she checked the system. Hayes exhaled slowly, keeping his posture upright, disciplined. His focus remained ahead, but his mind was elsewhere, on the family waiting for Private Dawson. On the promise that no fallen soldier would ever be left behind. It was a promise Hayes had dedicated his life to upholding. What he didn't know yet was that this time, things wouldn't go as expected. This time, his duty would be tested, not by a battlefield, but by an unexpected fight he never anticipated having to face. Colonel Richard Hayes had learned long ago to recognize hesitation. It was in the subtle flicker of someone's eyes, the slight shift in their posture, the careful way their fingers hovered just a moment too long before making a decision. And as the airline agent, her name tag reading Lisa, scanned his paperwork, that hesitation became unmistakable. She had started out efficient, her hands moving quickly over the keyboard, her gaze flicking between the screen and his military orders. But then something changed. Her fingers slowed, her eyes narrowed slightly, lips pressing together as if something in the system wasn't quite right. Then came the pause, not long enough for most people to notice. But Hayes did. He'd seen it before in government offices, in bureaucratic meetings, even on foreign soil when negotiations turned cold. It was the pause of uncertainty, the kind that often preceded an excuse. Lisa glanced sideways at her colleague, another airline employee stationed a few feet away, before leaning in and whispering something. The other agent, a man in his 40s with a tired expression, turned his head slightly, taking in the scene. His gaze met Lisa's, then briefly flickered to Hayes before he muttered something back. Lisa straightened, schooling her face into a neutral expression, but the stiffness in her smile betrayed her discomfort. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, her voice carefully measured, "but there seems to be an issue with your ticket. We can't allow you to board at this time." Hayes didn't move, didn't flinch. His mind immediately dissected the situation. An issue with the ticket? That was unlikely. His orders were clear, his paperwork processed well in advance. He had traveled on military assignments more times than he could count. He knew the protocol, and more importantly, he knew there was no regulation that should be preventing him from boarding this flight. Calmly, he tapped the papers on the counter. "This is a military assignment. Everything should be in order, he said, his voice even. Would you mind checking again? Lisa's smile remained, but it faltered just slightly around the edges. I understand, sir, but unfortunately, there's a security protocol in place. We're unable to override it. Security protocol. It was a vague enough phrase to sound official. But Hayes wasn't buying it. If there truly was a security issue, it would have been flagged long before he reached the counter. Someone higher up would have contacted him. There would have been procedures in place. Specific instructions. Not a last-minute denial without explanation. He kept his posture steady, his expression unreadable. Which security protocol is preventing me from boarding? Lisa hesitated again. The tired-looking agent shifted slightly in his seat. She flicked another glance toward her colleague, as if hoping he would step in. He didn't. I'm afraid I can't go into details, sir. Behind Hayes, the low murmur of conversation began to change. Passengers waiting in line had started to take notice. A woman adjusting the strap of her purse glanced over, her brow furrowing slightly. A businessman tapping away on his phone paused mid-text, looking up just long enough to register that something unusual was happening. The energy in the line had shifted. People were beginning to watch. Hayes exhaled slowly, keeping his patience in check. This wasn't a war zone. It wasn't a negotiation table with lives hanging in the balance. But it was wrong, and wrong needed to be confronted. He squared his shoulders. Let's be clear, I'm escorting the remains of a fallen soldier. My documentation is valid, my orders are official, and there is no legitimate reason for me to be denied boarding. He didn't raise his voice, but there was a quiet authority in his tone that made it impossible to ignore. Lisa swallowed, her fingers flexing slightly on the keyboard. Behind her, the other agent, still watching, shifted again, this time uncomfortably. But she didn't relent. I'm very sorry, Colonel Hayes, she said, her voice more rigid now, as if bracing for the next wave of resistance. But there's nothing I can do. Behind him, the line was no longer just watching. They were waiting. The murmurs had grown louder. A young man in a hoodie frowned as he took out his phone. A middle-aged couple exchanged whispers, their eyes flicking between Hayes and the airline employees. A few people stepped slightly closer, craning their necks, sensing that something wasn't right. Hayes remained motionless, but his mind was already working through the next steps. He wasn't leaving without an answer. And he wasn't leaving without Private Michael Dawson. Colonel Richard Hayes remained still, his expression unreadable, but inside, his patience was wearing thin. He had faced resistance before, but not like this, not from the very country he had sworn to serve. Behind him, the murmurs of the passengers were growing louder. People were shifting in place, sensing that this was no ordinary delay, no routine bureaucratic mix-up. There was something else happening here, and the crowd knew it. And then, a voice cut through the low hum of conversation. Sir, do you have an issue with his military clearance? The voice was steady, firm, the kind of voice that carried weight. That made people stop and listen. Hayes turned his head slightly. The man who had spoken stood a few places behind him in line. He was older, maybe in his mid-60s, with a strong, weathered face that had seen its share of battles. A faded USMC cap was pulled low over his brow. His posture straight despite the years that had passed since his service. A Marine, Jim Calloway, the airline supervisor, Mark Evans, had just stepped forward, clearly hoping to de-escalate the situation before it spiraled any further. But now, Calloway had joined in, and Hayes could see the slight flicker of unease in the supervisor's eyes. No, sir, Evans said, his voice carefully measured. This isn't about clearance. We just have to follow standard protocol. Calloway let out a sharp breath through his nose, folding his arms over his chest. Yeah, he said, his tone laced with skepticism. I've been through security 1,000 times, and I've never seen protocol stop a soldier from escorting one of our own home. His words rippled through the crowd like a dropped stone in water. More people turned their attention toward the counter, their expressions shifting from casual curiosity to concern. A young man in a hoodie, who had been scrolling through his phone, suddenly stopped and frowned. A woman in a red blazer whispered something to her husband. Another passenger, a middle-aged woman in a denim jacket, crossed her arms, shaking her head. Something was off, and now everyone could feel it. Then, another sound, a faint, familiar click. Someone had started recording. The tension thickened. The airline staff noticed it, too. Lisa, the agent who had initially denied Hayes his flight, kept her gaze fixed on her computer screen, avoiding eye contact. Evans, the supervisor, shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat as if trying to buy himself a few seconds to think. But Calloway wasn't done. He took a step forward, closing the distance between himself and the counter. "I want to hear it straight," he said, his voice steady but firm. "Is there a real security issue here? Or is this some bureaucratic nonsense?" Evans hesitated. That hesitation was all the confirmation Calloway needed. A few more passengers reached for their phones. Screens lit up. Fingers moved quickly as people began typing. Some started recording video. Others were already posting online. And just like that, the situation had shifted. This was no longer just an airline issue. This was a moment. The kind of moment that, in the digital age, could explode beyond the walls of the terminal. And the airline staff knew it. Lisa's fingers twitched over her keyboard, her shoulders tensing. Evans adjusted his name tag, glancing toward the back of the counter as if silently wishing for reinforcements. The crowd wasn't just watching anymore. They were waiting. For an answer. For an explanation. For justice. Hayes stood tall, his military posture unwavering. He didn't need to say anything. Not yet. The moment was building. And it was only just beginning. The tension in the terminal had shifted from mild confusion to something heavier. Something charged. It wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore. It was turning into a moment. And moments like these didn't stay contained for long. A young woman near the middle of the line hesitated for only a second before unlocking her phone. She had been watching the entire interaction, Colonel Richard Hayes standing firm. The airline staff fumbling for excuses. The retired Marine Jim Calloway refusing to back down. It didn't sit right with her. So she tapped the live stream button. "I don't usually do this," she said, her voice quiet but determined. "But I need to make sure people see this." The shaky frame of her camera caught the scene in front of her, the colonel in his uniform, his paperwork still resting on the counter, the nervous glances exchanged between airline employees, and the growing number of passengers turning their attention toward the standoff. Within minutes, the video started gaining viewers. First a few dozen, then a few hundred, then thousands. Across the airport, another man had taken out his phone. Unlike the young woman, he didn't hesitate. His fingers moved quickly as he composed a tweet. "They just denied a U.S. Army colonel his flight while he's escorting a fallen soldier's remains. This is how we treat our heroes. #LetHimFly." It took less than 5 minutes for the tweet to explode. Thousands of likes, hundreds of retweets, comments flooding in. Then another tweet, this time from a veteran advocacy group. "We are aware of the disgraceful incident happening at airport name. Expect action. Our soldiers deserve better." The crowd in the terminal hadn't seen these tweets yet. But they felt it. Something was happening. The air was different now. A crackling energy of awareness. People were no longer just witnessing the event. They were participating in it. Phones were out. Screens were glowing. Fingers were typing. And behind the airline counter, Mark Evans was starting to sweat. He had seen situations like this before. A disgruntled passenger. A social media complaint. Maybe even a viral post now and then. But this was different. This was gaining traction fast. Lisa, the airline agent who had initially denied Colonel Hayes, was staring at her screen. But it was clear she wasn't reading anything. Her fingers hovered uselessly over the keyboard. Her expression tight. Then a notification popped up on Evan's phone. He almost didn't look, but something about the way it buzzed made his stomach twist. A news outlet had just reached out for comment. His heart sank. This wasn't going away. And now, everyone in the airport, and beyond, was watching. And waiting. Mark Evans was out of his depth. What had started as a routine denial A decision he had assumed would go unnoticed had now spiraled into something much bigger. The murmurs in the terminal had turned into full-fledged conversations. People weren't just watching anymore. They were engaged. Phones were out, fingers tapping away, voices raised in quiet outrage. And the airline had lost control of the narrative. That was why David Langford was here now. Langford, a senior airline executive, had been pulled into the mess the moment corporate realized what was happening. He had arrived in a crisp navy suit, his ID badge clipped neatly to his pocket, his presence exuding authority. His walk was brisk, controlled, a man used to putting out fires. Only this time, the fire was already burning out of control. He took one look at the scene before him, the uniformed colonel standing tall at the counter, the Marine nearby with his arms folded, the growing number of passengers still recording, and knew the airline had made a critical mistake. Fix it, now. Langford approached the counter, his expression carefully composed. Colonel Hayes, he said, his voice smooth and professional. I want to personally apologize for this inconvenience. There's clearly been a miscommunication. Hayes remained still, his face unreadable. Miscommunication. He had been in the military long enough to know what that word really meant. It meant, we got caught. It meant, fix this before it costs us too much. Langford gestured toward the gate. We'd like to upgrade you to first-class accommodations and ensure that you and the remains of Private Dawson are taken care of properly. The words were polished, practiced, designed to de-escalate. But Hayes wasn't interested in de-escalation. He was interested in the truth. He studied Langford for a long moment before speaking. Let me ask you something. Mr. Langford, he said, his tone steady. If no one had spoken up, if no one had started recording, would I still be standing here? Silence. Langford's jaw tightened, but he recovered quickly. Colonel, we take all of our passengers' concerns very seriously. That's not what I asked. More silence. Someone in the crowd murmured. He's right. Hayes exhaled, his patience razor thin. This isn't about first class. It's not about convenience. It's about respect. The Marine, Jim Calloway, let out a quiet grunt of approval. The young woman still live streaming the event gave a nod. Her phone locked onto the scene. People in the terminal shifted, waiting for Langford's response. But Langford had none. Because there wasn't one. The truth was already out. And no amount of corporate smooth talking could change what had just happened. The airline had already lost. And the world was still watching. The tension in the terminal had reached its breaking point. Passengers stood frozen in place. Ice flicking between Colonel Richard Hayes and the airline executives scrambling to regain control. Phones remained raised, capturing every second, every word. The hashtag let him fly was still spreading like wildfire. And the airline staff knew it. They had lost. And then, the air shifted. A presence entered the scene. Not frantic like the airline employees. Not impatient like the restless travelers. This presence carried authority. Deliberate footsteps echoed across the tile floor. The crowd instinctively parted, as if making way for something greater. A man in a dark blue suit strode toward them. His posture impeccable. His ID badge flashing under the fluorescent lights. His face was unreadable, but his gaze was sharp, assessing everything in seconds. He was military, and he was here for Hayes. Stopping just short of the counter, he extended his hand. Colonel, I'm Major Thomas Beckett, Department of the Army. His voice was firm, crisp, meant to be obeyed. We've been informed of the situation. Hayes shook his hand, his grip strong. He didn't need to ask how the major had arrived so quickly. The military doesn't play games when it comes to its own. Beckett turned to the airline representatives. His expression unreadable. This is no longer your concern. He stated plainly, Colonel Hayes and the remains of Private First Class Michael Dawson will not be flying commercial. Lisa, the agent who had first denied Hayes his flight, looked like she wanted to disappear. Mark Evans, the supervisor, swallowed hard, and David Langford, the airline executive, tried, and failed, to mask his discomfort. Sir, Langford started, clearly hoping to salvage something. Anything. We were just in the process of Beckett didn't let him finish. You were just about to cover your tracks. He interrupted, his voice polite but cutting. We are handling this now. A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. The passengers felt the shift in power. The airline staff were no longer in control. Hayes met Beckett's gaze. What's the plan, Major? Beckett nodded once. The Pentagon has arranged for a private military flight. Your transport is waiting. The relief didn't show on Hayes' face. He was too disciplined for that. But it was there. The mission was back on course. Beckett turned back to Langford one last time. His voice was calm, but there was no room for negotiation. This will be addressed. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. Without another word, Hayes adjusted his uniform, squared his shoulders, and turned toward the exit. The fallen soldier he was escorting would be treated with the dignity he deserved. And the airline? The fallout had only just begun. By the time Colonel Richard Hayes and Private First Class Michael Dawson's remains were safely aboard the military transport, the damage to the airline had already begun. It started online. The hashtag let him fly didn't just trend, it exploded. Millions of views, tens of thousands of retweets, videos from the airport, grainy phone footage of Hayes standing firm, of the airline staff fumbling for answers, of Major Thomas Beckett shutting him down, flooded social media. Then, the news outlets picked it up. Airline denies U.S. Army colonel flight while escorting fallen soldier. Viral video sparks outrage. Airline faces backlash over military disrespect. Veterans call for boycott following airline's disgraceful treatment of Colonel Hayes. The outrage was immediate and relentless. Veterans organizations issued statements condemning the airline's actions. Politicians weighed in, demanding accountability. Celebrities, influencers, and military families joined the conversation, sharing their disgust. Then came the financial hit. The airline's stock plummeted. Investors grew nervous, watching as their brand crumbled under the weight of public fury. Customers flooded their social media pages, canceling flights, demanding explanations, swearing never to fly with them again. Then the final blow, a lawsuit. A coalition of military advocacy groups filed a formal complaint against the airline, citing discrimination and failure to uphold service member protections. Legal analysts on television debated the consequences. The pressure mounted. And finally, the airline's CEO appeared on television. His expression carefully rehearsed, his words meticulously chosen. This was a regrettable misunderstanding. He said, "We deeply respect our service members, and we are taking immediate steps to ensure nothing like this ever happens again." It was too little, too late. The public wasn't buying it. Because they knew the truth, the airline hadn't apologized because they were sorry. They apologized because they got caught. And no PR statement could undo what had already been. The air was crisp as Colonel Richard Hayes stepped onto the tarmac, the weight of his duty settling on his shoulders. The private military transport had landed smoothly. And now, at last, Private First Class Michael Dawson was home. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the gathered crowd. The Dawson family stood just beyond the casket, grief etched into their faces, their hands clasped tightly together. They had waited for this moment, dreading it, needing it. Hayes stood at attention as the honor guard carefully lifted the flag-draped casket, moving in perfect, solemn synchrony. Every step, every movement, was done with purpose, because this wasn't just a task. It was a promise. As the casket was presented, Michael Dawson's mother clutched her husband's arm, her eyes brimming with tears. A younger sister, barely in her teens, held onto the folded flag in her hands as though it were the last piece of her brother she could keep. Hayes remained still, watching, allowing the family their moment. This was why he had fought so hard. Not for social media attention. Not for public outrage. Not to make a statement. But because respect should never have to be demanded, it should be given freely. Later, as he stood by Dawson's gravesite, he reflected on everything that had transpired. The battle at the airport hadn't been fought with weapons or strategy. But it had been a battle nonetheless, a battle for decency, for dignity, for what was right, and the reality was clear. It shouldn't have taken viral outrage to ensure a fallen soldier received the honor he was owed. But there was something else. Something greater. The passengers who had spoken up. The Marine. The young woman who had live-streamed. The strangers who had refused to look away. They had proved something. That silence enables injustice. That complacency allows disrespect to continue. That ordinary people, standing together, can force change. It hadn't been the power of a uniform that had won the fight at the airport. It had been the power of people. As Hayes turned to leave, he gave one final nod toward Private Dawson's resting place. His heart steady, mission complete, and somewhere, in corporate offices and boardrooms, the airline executives were still scrambling, still calculating the damage. But for Colonel Hayes, it was simple. Some fights were about more than policies or protocols. Some fights were about principle. And this one had been worth it. Respect should never be optional. It shouldn't take a viral video for our heroes to receive the dignity they deserve. Today, people stood up, spoke out, and made a difference. But this shouldn't be the exception. It should be the standard. If you believe in accountability, if you believe in honoring those who serve, let your voice be heard. Because silence allows injustice to continue. But standing together, that creates change. Thank you for watching. And remember, respect is not a privilege. It's a right. Would you like a call to action added? Such as asking viewers to share, comment, or support veterans organizations?